Hey team, welcome to the podcast. I'm with Pat DeVilly today and we're going to go a mile deep. Actually really excited and had a real pang of jealousy when Pat released his book called Shadow. Is it Shadow?
Shadow work.
Shadow work. And one of the things that I admire about you, dude, is that everything, like we've walked a very similar journey in our transformational career. And you've always done amazing stuff. So first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm reflecting on, I think it's probably 15 years since we first met, and we were boys. I think we're grown up now, but it's been amazing. We have been on parallel journeys in many ways, but yeah, we first met running hill sprints in Wales with Phil Richards,
Oh my
right?
God. Yeah, right. Yeah. So the theme of the podcast is going a mile deep. And what I've brought Pat on today to talk about is this idea of going a mile deep and understanding the structures, the thinking, the work that you need to do as a leader to perform at your very highest. And Pat is I think what you've got, Pat, watching your career, Pat started the body transformation world like I did. You've gone a mile deep into somatic work and breath work and shadow. Help the audience understand why that's necessary for leaders and high performing people to do that work.
One piece that I always come back to is the idea that, we just mentioned meeting each other 12 years ago and we mature biologically. We all mature biologically. We get older, we get grayer, we change. But psychologically, oftentimes we get stuck. So we don't mature psychologically or emotionally unless we choose to and do the work. So, a typical example of that is a teenage boy that has a lot of insecurity and starts trying to prove himself to the world, becomes a 40, 50, 60-year-old man who's still playing out the same patterns. And that's the piece. I think it's like updating our hardware, if you will, like going back and figuring out like what's really driving me. And my own journey into this stuff definitely came from being insecure, feeling like success would fix me and make me feel good in myself, achieving everything I set out to, and feeling even more insecure, just thinking like, what's wrong with me? There's something wrong here. And kind of cliche, but I ran out of places to look. I looked everywhere for happiness, and then I had to kind of look in the mirror.
It's actually like, I think it gets, I was like joking with my brother the other day, my brother's just hit 30. And I think, you're talking about the kind of ascension or what's the word for it? Initiation from boy to man. It happens in your 30s. It's just like, it's like a sweet spot. It's like, oh shit, some of my mates are getting, children, and all of a sudden people aren't partying all the time. And I've got to start taking life a bit more seriously. Like I had children at 35. You feel this real necessity to grow up. And I think it hits, like, for me, it hit at 30. It was like, holy moly, I got some work to do. And it was actually my divorce which initiated that. And one of the things that I was really curious about was actually discovering shadow at 30. So I remember going to a men's group. It was Craig's, both our good friend Craig White. And he talked about this idea of the shadow. And I was like, holy shit. And as he started explaining it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is affecting my whole life. And I didn't see it. So what I'd love you to do, Pat, because I think you could probably do a real good job of this, is explain what is shadow and shadow work, and why would it be effective for somebody who is leading a team or trying to get a hold of their life to engage with that work?
I'll start with, there's a quote from Anthony de Mello, who was a Jesuit priest, really interesting character. When he died, the church didn't know what to do because he'd spent his life telling people to look at themselves, not to look outward. But he had a quote and he said, what you're aware of, you're in control of. And what you're not aware of is in control of you. So what you're aware of, you're in control of. What you're not aware of is in control of you. Carl Jung, who's kind of the godfather of shadow work, had a similar quote: until you make the unconscious conscious, it will run your life and you'll call it fate. And both of those quotes kind of point to this idea that a lot of our behaviors, our actions, our cycles, our addictions, our ways of being in relationship are driven by unconscious material that's kind of in the dark. And so, put simply, we come into the world as boys and hopefully are welcomed with open arms. We can show all aspects of ourselves. We can laugh, cry, dance, run around naked, have a pot belly. There's kind of no judgment, no expectation on ourselves. But then as we become socialized, we start to pick up rules as to who we need to be loved. So I always say there's kind of 3 layers. You've got your initial layer, which is your family. You quickly learn, okay, for me to maintain the love of my family, I've got to hide certain aspects and I've got to almost exaggerate the opposite. So some households, it's good to be quiet. Other households, it's good to be extrovert. And so every household will be different. And you start to condition yourself. And there's a split that occurs. You're no longer unconditional. You now love yourself when you're a certain way and don't when you're the opposite. That's the first layer. Then you go.
The breaks part actually, because actually I want to talk about myself, and if you want to talk about you as well, it's like, so you're saying like in my family, it was like be active. So it was like be active, be extrovert, be loud. That was my family blueprint, really.
Mm-hmm. And so potentially in that, Ben, you've got, we'd say that we form the persona, which is the mask that we present outwardly. So oftentimes, be extroverted, be sporty, be loud. Was that what you said?
Yeah.
Something along those lines?
Yeah.
Generally, the opposite traits will be kind of hidden away. So being quiet, being the opposite of sporty, those things almost get pushed away and are seen as not having value.
Yeah.
And I sort of put it to people that when you're a kid, it's black and white, there's good and there's bad. But as we get older, you could see the value in everything,
Big insight here then, right? Because one of the things that was happening for me at 30, I'm not really seeing this until you were talking then, is that be active. One of the things I couldn't do was rest. I was so tired, burnt out, like pushing myself so hard at that point because I was hurting. I was hurting. So be slow, be quiet, have solitude, all the things that I wasn't doing. Part of my shadow was so pushed down. It was actually on that men's retreat. I was like sat there meditating, and I was like, I've never done this. I've never done this work. And that part was really, really problematic for me because I just tried to work through my pain. Like I was like, every time I'd feel pain, I was just like, push myself harder, make some more sales, do more work.
I think there's two things in that. There's one is, so persona again is a mask that we show to the world. You can think about that as what we're proud of, but by being proud of something, inherently you're almost ashamed of the opposite. So it's very common what you just mentioned. If I'm very proud of my work ethic, oftentimes I'll be ashamed of what I might call laziness, which in reality might just be rest.
Was that similar for you? Like, was anything different? Because you're a hustler. I remember you would like output a lot.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Look, so much of my behavior in my 20s was driven from insecurity and wanting validation and approval. And it's still, I would often say how our parents related to us and our emotions becomes how we relate to our own emotions. So my father's a great man, but really hard worker. And if I was ever anxious growing up, my father would say, when I was your age, I didn't have time to be anxious. And so my narrative now when I experience anxiety is, I don't have time for this. I have to kind of check myself and switch it out,
Yeah, I was like, recently I bought a couch. It's like I bought a couch before we just moved apartments in Dubai, and I bought this freaking massive couch. It's huge. I've never bought a nice couch before. I've always had couches that I can't sleep on. And I can sleep on this couch. Me and Poppy can sleep either end. I was like, We can lie either end. It's been life-changing. I've never slept so much. And actually, I've made more money in the last couple of months since I've had the couch than ever before.
Well, Ben, like we talk about 30 being this initiation, and I think in some regards, like the aspects that we're proud of, like the work ethic and the hustling and all this stuff, it gets us to a certain point. But then at 30, that's when you first recognize that, being a one-dimensional man, or like only having John Wineland, who's someone I really admired, talks about range, like having range as a man. So it's great that you can be a hustler, but can you be present with your kids, and can you be present with yourself, and just having this range of different aspects you can tap into. So I think the way of the one-dimensional man is it's very limited, and I think there's more to us.
So the family, the first one. What was the second one?
Family is first. So then you kind of take your first steps into the community. That could be a sports team. It could be, your neighboring friends. It could be the school. And it's kind of confusing then because sometimes there's contradictory rules. So at home, your parents want you to do well in your results, but if you do too well in school, you're going to be ridiculed and teased by your friends. So you've now kind of got new adaptations to make. And then your third would be the culture that you grow up in, which is, the media. Like we would have seen Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone. This is like how we should look.
Yeah.
The country we were raised in, I'm Irish, like don't get above your station. I'm Catholic, or I was Catholic. This is like more of it. So religion, media, your gender, boys don't cry, girls don't get angry, all these messages we receive. So there's a huge amount of editing. And Gabor Mate talks about your childhood. You've got this battle between being authentic and being yourself, or being accepted and having attachment. And A child needs to choose attachment because they need to stay safe and they need to stay connected. They can't choose themselves. And so we reject ourselves.
I've never heard of those three friends. So you're saying the family, the immediate circle of friends, and also culture, they form the initial shadow.
This is how I leverage it, at least in my mind. Yeah, you've got a rule book. Like those are the places you need to fit in. You know, you think about your culture, there's certain countries where being an individual and being a leader is really admired. There's other countries where that's frowned upon. Some countries where nudity is welcomed and other countries where it's not. So like there's so many influences, but we're a product of our environment. And the ultimate question is, am I safe and will I be loved? And if not, who do I need to become to be safe and to be loved?
Yeah, because one of the things that I still work with Kristen Sargent. I've actually got a podcast with her this evening. And when I started doing shadow work, and the way they do it at the Tools Group is like you create this real clear image of your shadow. You build a relationship with the shadow. You give time and focus to the shadow, and you see it. And I really struggled to make that image. And that the framework you've just given has actually helped me see bits of I've actually got this really quiet, reserved, slow person that I don't consult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I do more so now. Actually, even last night, I had this real calling to go and ice bath and sauna, and I was like, this is illogical. It doesn't make any sense. It's like 8-9 o'clock. I'm driving an hour across Dubai to go, and I was like, no, I know I need to go, and I've trusted more of that kind of restful, focus part of myself now than ever, and that's really working for me.
You know, I like that there's different ways. I think you introduced me to some of the work of the Tools, and I did their meditations around shadow and similar. I probably didn't relate to it as much, but I like that the 3 spheres has been useful for me. Another frame that's useful is we all experience emotional pain when we're younger. We have bullying or neglect or ridicule or shame or subtle things happen that we take as personal. And a very simple lens that I encourage people to consider sometimes is there will have been pain of disconnect or not having your needs met. As a result of the pain, you will have come up with strategies unconsciously to not experience that pain again. And then over time, those strategies become defenses. So simple level, I was bullied when I was a kid. My strategy was to become a people pleaser and to put other people's feelings above my own. And then the defense going forward is that I will always be the nice guy. So this is a really common one. So again, that might be useful for people. Look at the first 18 years of your life, pick out the pivotal moments that were kind of painful or difficult. Ask, how did I adapt or who did I become to deal with that pain? And effectively that adaptation oftentimes becomes a big part of our personality. And that's what's keeping us removed from the pain that we didn't want to feel at the time or couldn't feel at the time.
Yeah, as he was saying that, my stepfather died when I was 17, and like he was the leader of the family, so I became the kind of leader, and that's quite interesting because I go into leadership when I need to sometimes just submit and just instead of leading everyone else, I need to focus on myself. So that's quite an interesting one. But
do you know Dick Schwartz, Ben? Have you come across internal and family systems and Dick Schwartz?
No, I've not done any work, and I don't really know much about internal family systems. I understand how powerful it is because I've heard different coaches who've done it talk about that kind of makeup. Do you want to touch on that, Pat? Do you want to share a bit?
Well, there's just one piece that I often reference that I think is useful for people to kind of play with is sometimes we think like I'm sat in front of Ben and Ben's sat in front of Pat and we're this one man, but we're made up of a multitude of characters and subpersonalities or archetypes or whatever language we want to use. And Dick Schwartz uses this analogy of imagine a bus and the bus is full of people sat there and hopefully the healthy, sovereign adults is driving the bus. But when we get stressed, oftentimes our parts that have kept us safe run to the front of the bus and say, I got this. So, in the example you just shared, it could be that there's stress happening at home and the leader part of you wants to step in and say, I got this. And they're going to show up in a certain way. And I think the value in just recognizing that is, the question we could ask ourselves is, who do I become when I'm stressed? And then we don't shame or make any of our parts wrong. That's a really important aspect of any healing work is we try to understand like, okay, this makes complete sense on some level. In some ways, it's keeping me away from the very thing I want, but in another way, it's keeping me very safe,
Yeah, it's like when you said that, who do I be when I'm the warrior? The warrior grabs the bus, the steering wheel and is driving. And I think that's for so many guys, especially, is that as soon as stress kicks off, the king's off the seat, the warrior's trying to grab the wheel. And actually, especially if it's emotional stress, it should be the lover and like compassion. And, that's, and I see so many of the clients I've worked with, and I've seen myself in highly stressful situation, which actually needs empathy, connection, slowness, softness. They just do not show up with the lover. They show up with the warrior.
I spoke to Dick a couple of years ago on my podcast when I had a podcast, but I kind of subtly asked him to do a therapy piece with me in the moment, and I wasn't going to turn down the opportunity because he's world class. And I asked him about this overworking part that I have, like this overworker. Anytime I'm stressed, I know I need a break, but I just keep working, and the more stressed I get, the more I work. And he asked me a few questions, and people could put these questions to themselves. The first question was, I think first it was, where do you feel it in your body, or what image comes to mind? And I had this kind of image of just someone hustling and just being exhausted, but hustling was like really tired character in my mind. And then he said, can we connect with that part and ask that part, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't do your job? So what are you afraid would happen if you didn't do your job of overworking? And my answer was, I'd be afraid that I wasn't enough. And then he'd say, how old is the part that feels it wouldn't be enough? And I was 6 or 7. And then he said, what was happening at that time? And I told him what was happening. And he said, okay, so on some level, it makes complete sense that this part of you is trying to keep you safe. So a real compassionate lens. But then the invitation was like, how old is this part you think you are? And I said, oh, he still thinks I'm like 8 or 9 and I'm this insecure little boy. And he said, can you tell him you're 35 now and ask him if he'd like to do a different job? And he said, I said, yeah, you're kind of playing with imagination, obviously. But he asked me, like, how does that part feel now? Or what do you notice in them? Or what do they want to do now? And I said, they want to take a fucking holiday. They're so tired from working for all my life. And it was powerful. So it's really just recognizing that things we beat ourselves up about. I have this belief that everything we do comes from positive intent on some level, even if it's a negative action. So like over drinking, you might beat yourself up if you drink too much, but maybe there's a part of you that doesn't know how to soothe your emotions, and you found this way of soothing your emotions through alcohol. So it's not the best thing in the world, but we do the best with what we know. So you got to appreciate your parts.
Say that again, because that's really, really, really good. What was that? So everything we do is through...
I think everything comes from positive intent on some level, or, you know, a frame that I offer is that we're always trying to meet our needs. So like everyone's got needs. And if we don't meet the needs in conscious ways, so an example is, I just moved to Bali. It's a new place. I got to build a new community here. If I don't consciously look to connect with people in a healthy way, I'm going to get lonely. And the loneliness is going to be pointing me toward a need that I'm not meeting. And if I don't acknowledge that, I'll probably unconsciously try to meet my needs, and I'll find myself in the pub drinking. And on some level, I'll be like, why am I drinking? But a deeper part of me just really craves connection. And I'm not consciously getting it. So if you look at behaviors you're doing that don't make sense, if people are watching porn and they can't stop watching porn, you can ask yourself, what is the need that I'm meeting through this behavior? And is there a healthier way of meeting this need? I worked with a gambling addict years ago, and I often share the example that I would ask him, what's it giving you? And he said, it's taking everything from me. It doesn't give me anything. And I said, it has to be giving you something. You're not a stupid man. You're doing it for a reason. And we peeled back the layers, and eventually we came to the conclusion he had no friends, no family. And the only place in his life where there was social connection was in the bookies. So he kept going back because we all need social connection. And that lens just allows you then to start thinking about, how could I do this in a more empowering and healthy way?
Yeah, I love that statement, which is every behavior serves a function. You've got to be aware of that function. I'd say really interesting, actually, because I look at, especially with me, is that like I quit porn and then quit porn, but I didn't resolve the sexual side that wasn't being met. And I worked with a shaman like last year, and I went... And I had pains in my back, in my hip flexor, in my lower abdomen, and it was all like, literally, I would say that I had like a 9 out of 10 pain. It was like having the worst bad back ever. And it was affecting my training, all sorts. Been to loads of physios, chiropractors. I'd spent a lot of money trying to just fix this. Anyway, did what's called a hero's journey with one of my buddies who's coming on the podcast, and what it all was unresolved sexual energy that just wasn't being released. And also another one was unexpressed love, because I think it's like one thing I really got from it was like love is a caustic force as much as anger. If you leave it inside and you don't express it, it eats you up. And I was like, that was really, really helpful for me, because I was like, I felt so much love for my kids, for my friends, I just wasn't expressing it. Anyway, in the experience, it was like really, really vivid. It's like, stop bottling all this up. It's like, it's really causing problems. And it was almost like I was getting a waggling finger. I'll release it this time, but next time it's going to be worse. And I was like, so I was actually purging so much of this bad energy that was all stored in my belly, and it went into the experience 9 out of 10 back pain. The following morning, I woke up, I could touch my toes, and I was like, this is crazy. I was like, oh my gosh, I had this like for 4 months. It just all came out. And since that, I realized like how important it is for me as a leader, as a man, as a guy, as where I'm at in my life, to really express my love and emotion, but also to make sure my sex, the sex part of my life is really important for me as well, to get that right. Because I think so many people have so much pushed down emotion around that, like especially in that, we talk about body in a minute, because I know that's something that you're very, very in tune with, Pat. So what's your experience of that?
Well, I love what you just said, and I'm going to write that down after because I don't want to forget it. But what you said about I would always talk about anger, and we need to consciously express anger. But I as silly as it sounds, I hadn't considered with love that you shouldn't just let it sit there.
It's selfish as well.
Yeah, well, I was only thinking earlier, I remember hearing something a couple of years ago that was powerful. It was more around creativity and expressing ourselves, and expressing our gifts. But it was saying, if you think of an apple tree that doesn't let go of its apples, it's going to get sick. And so the apple tree lets go of the apples, and then more apples come. And it's definitely how I feel about sharing my gifts with the world. If I don't express myself honestly in the world, I feel awful. So I think it's similar with that piece on love.
Yeah, actually, it was actually really vivid. It was like, because I talked so much about anger being a caustic force. Like, so many guys can relate to that. You feel anger, you hold it in, you don't express it, you feel all stiffened up, and guys can get that. I'd never thought of love in the same way, but I realized there was so much stuff I wasn't saying and expressing to my, so when we, this is like going off a little bit, but at the same time, when we got married, me and Poppy, I wrote the most really heartfelt messages to my buddies, my close mates. It's like, I honestly love you. I'm really grateful for your friendship. And it was so helpful to do that. And I felt so good. And it wasn't just me trying to emotionally dump this load of love on people, but I realized how much I'd kept in about how much I loved my close mates and my family and people that were literally flying across the world to come to our wedding. And the person that's actually started speaking about it more is Marcus Buckingham in leadership. He talks a lot about love and leadership, and I'd never heard people talk about it until that point. And I was like, this is really interesting. And I actually think, going back to shadow, this is in a lot of people's shadows expressing love.
Well, is probably a good piece to touch on is the idea of the golden shadow, which oftentimes gets overlooked. And the golden shadow is the parts that maybe were too much when we were young. So the obvious stuff in shadow is things like anger, grief, rejection, envy, jealousy, all these things. The golden shadow is maybe as a child I was creative, but I grew up in a household where logic was valued and creativity was dismissed. So I hide my creativity. Maybe I grew up again in a house where I wanted to express myself, but it was all about children should be quiet. And so our golden shadow is the potential that gets hidden away in love. Is probably a huge part of that. If I grow up in a house where I'm not told that I'm loved, how would I learn to feel safe telling people that I love them? One of the ways we can start to spot our shadow, for good or for bad, well, it's all good stuff, ultimately. Carl Jung said 90% of the shadow is pure gold. But if you look at the people you project onto, so the people you admire in life show you your golden shadow. If I see people that are loving, caring, expressive, creative, compassionate, that's probably pointing to things that I would like to awaken more in myself. If I see people who I judge to be closed-minded, judgmental, ignorant, etc., they're pointing to parts of myself that I haven't made peace with. And it's the stuff that kind of disturbs you. It's when you have a disproportionate response to someone's behavior. That's when you know there's something in you. And effectively the work for me is when you've got people on a pedestal, you're looking up to them and you're creating impossible standards for yourself. When you've got people in the pit, you're looking down on them. And again, you're creating impossible standards for yourself, because we're all things. So if you can start to see your potential for both the gold and the dark, I think then you humanize yourself, but you also humanize others, because you see, again, everything makes sense on some level. So the person in work who's an asshole, and that's your judgment, they've got stuff going on. And I know that's easier said than done, but I think that's the work.
Yeah, because I always think that, because the popular term now is that you hear people saying you're triggered. And I don't think a lot of people know what that really means. And I think what you said there is, it's a disproportionate reaction to something. And I think that's what I help clients talk about this a lot. Is like a trigger is like I'm having a disproportionate reaction to something. It would look like, for example, I'm trying to think of a disproportionate reaction I've had. It's like a friend letting you down. It's like, oh yeah, it's not just like, oh, they've cancelled. It's like, I'm thinking about this all day. They've let me down. They've let me, they've cast me out. And when you have a disproportionate reaction, instead of saying, oh yeah, no worries, we'll reschedule, you're ruminating about it. You're villainizing them. That is disproportionate. And that's where the work is. And I think that's what leads you to your shadow, right?
Yeah, I mean the simple but not easy practice, I think, is when you notice emotional disturbance, so you notice trigger, I'd be asking myself, number one, what's the story I'm telling myself about the situation? Number two, what's the feeling below the story? And maybe number three, what's the need? So an example will be, like, I remember being in men's groups and I'd be triggered by someone in the group, but we'd go through processes to clear it. And ultimately what it would come down to was, okay, what's the judgment that I have about this man? He's unsafe. Okay, so that's the story I'm telling myself. This man is unsafe. He doesn't show up on time. He talks too much. I had all these judgments, but then they'd ask, like, what's the feeling below those judgments? I'd say, I'm scared. So that was really what was happening. That was the trigger was, I'm scared that if I share a part of myself with this man, it's not going to be held well because he seems irresponsible. So again, what's the story I'm telling myself when I'm triggered? What's the feeling beneath? And then maybe what's the need? So when you have a difficult feeling, it points to an unmet need. The feeling of anger points to a need for a boundary. The feeling of jealousy points to the need maybe for more expression. The feeling of grief maybe is a need for connection. Who knows? But I think that can be useful. How do I feel and what do I need? And how can I meet that need?
Have you put them in your book?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to say that. Yeah, by the way, Pat's got a book coming out. I'm going to plug it all the way through and I'm going to put the link in the comments. Like, that's really, really good because I think that's what some people haven't got. They don't have that emotional intelligence. Is like, I'm feeling anger. It's because of the outside world, and it's not like, well, what do I need, which is a boundary. And I don't think people even know how to set boundaries. Like, I think something I do really well is I actually very pragmatic around the steps to set boundaries. But I think that people don't understand what that even means, or like, I remember when I was, especially in my 20s, I didn't even know what a boundary was, and I had multiple people say, "You've got problems with your boundaries," and I was like, "Well, what does that even mean? Just being on time?" And I think that a lot of people, especially in the online space as well, they talk about these boundaries, but if you were to ask them to articulate what is boundary setting, they don't have a clue.
Yeah, the language gets weaponized, right? Sometimes there are people who have shitty behavior and they'll say, I'm just setting a boundary. It's like, no, you didn't express, you didn't share what you were doing. You just kind of, I don't know, change the goalposts.
Yeah, you said at the start, and something that I've not done, I think that one of the problems that I've had with shadow work, it's been largely cognitive. It's been thinky work. And what I like about what you're doing and the pathway you've gone down is it's more body based. Can you share a bit more about that? Because I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, what you were sharing earlier is definitely part of it in terms of like the stuck energy, and through a shamanic lens or through a spiritual lens, if you want to use that kind of language, people will talk about energy and energy blockages and this kind of stuff. But on a very physical level, it's the same thing. It's energy blockages. So I'm a big fan of Alexander Lowen. He came up with a form of psychotherapy called bioenergetics, and it was all body-based. And the idea, put very simply, is imagine a little boy who's told, boys don't cry. What's he going to do? He's going to stop breathing, and he's going to tense his body, and he's not going to make any sound. So the sound disappears, the movement disappears, and the energy stops moving in the body. So we physically armor around the feelings that we don't want to feel, and we create these holding patterns and tension. So typically it's either chronic tension in the body, which I certainly have a lot of still, or it's dead spots in the body where we just can't feel our bodies. So the somatic work, I mean, the simple example would be if I sit with someone for an hour and we talk about their shadow, their defense mechanisms are going to be there for the first 45 minutes, and we might crack it toward the end of the 15 minutes or the hour, the last 15. But with the breath work and stuff like that, the form of breath work I do is conscious connected, which is simply connecting your breath, meaning there's no gap or pause between the breath. And for me, the logic with that is that when you experience overwhelming situations in your life, again, typically you'll probably gasp or you'll stop breathing or you'll breathe more shallow. And so if someone starts to breathe deeply and keeps the breath connected with no gaps or pauses, effectively what happens is the neocortex, so the front of the brain that's got all our defense strategies and all our ways of being and has a story about who Pat is and who Pat is supposed to be and all this stuff, that starts to quieten down, and we get more access to limbic brain, which is emotional brain. And that's where my memories are, that's where my emotions are. And I become more embodied. I become more aware of what's happening in my body. It's like the breath is bringing energy to the dead spots. And then my shadow appears, because shadow is unconscious material. So when this starts getting quiet, then the deeper stuff comes through. For me, that's the basic role of the body in it all. And the other piece is, we talk about triggers. You can say you're not an angry person if you've rejected your anger, for example, and anger's in your shadow. Oh, I see it here in Bali. Like everyone's, oh, I'm spiritual bypassing, and oh, I'm a beautiful person with love and light and all this kind of stuff, which is nice. That's like, that's a lovely idea.
If you're saying that, you've definitely got it.
Your beautiful conscious mind is saying that, but when someone cuts you off in traffic, your body is telling you you're pissed off. So our body speaks, right? And look, I'm still a very heady person. I grew up living in my head to protect myself, to keep myself safe, and living in strategies and like, how do I so that's why I've needed the breath work and the trauma release work and the different forms of body work to kind of come into the body.
Yeah, I like that. I like that metaphor, is that this kind of really sold shadow work for me. Like, this was like, imagine a beach ball covered in all of your traits and the things that you want people to see and don't want people to see, and the things that you don't want people to see are on the bottom, and that you're constantly pushing down on that beach ball to hide it from the world. And all of that energy that you're using, holding that back, if you let that go, that's what you use to propel yourself forward. And I was like, that really, like, that's why I need to do the work. Like, that's what I want to use, that energy to push forwards. And like, going back to, a lot of people listening, leaders listening, is like, I'm using so much energy holding all this anger back, or holding all this grief back, or holding all this creativity or love back. If I could just accept that same energy, I get to be more expressive. I'm not going to get cancer or heart disease, whatever. The second thing is, I've got so much more energy to move forwards. And I see people, and you can see that there's so many breaks on them moving forward. And often it is in shadow, I think, that the latent potential lies, right?
Yeah, something I sometimes share, my experience of being a man and a boy, was that most emotions were not welcome. So like, you weren't supposed to cry, you weren't supposed to even be happy, because there was something wrong with you if you were too happy, there was something wrong with you if you were crying. So anger was one of the few emotions that was quote unquote safe to show, because if I show my anger, I keep myself safe and I can push you away. So like, it was like this hormonal angry teenager. Like, that was the depth of what I would allow myself to feel. And the way I put it to people is, like, our inner world is a reflection of our outer world. So if I'm afraid of my own fear, if I'm afraid to feel fear, I will manipulate my whole life so that I don't have to be put in situations that are scary. If I'm afraid of my own anger, I'll continually put myself in situations where I won't get angry. And so my world becomes very small outwardly until I start to make peace with the parts inwardly. It works both ways, in the sense that if I step into something scary in the outer world, I become more accepting of myself. But equally, the more, if I deny my sexuality, then I'm going to shut down my sexual life. If I deny, or it's going to be, not in a healthy way. So I sometimes think of it as all these rules that we set for ourselves unconsciously, like the school, the community, the culture. It's like a prison or a box that gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's no wonder guys have a midlife crisis. A good kind of definition I had of the midlife crisis recently, which I thought was clever, was, for a lot of us as teenage boys, if we even had an idea of our needs then, we shut off from them at that point, because all that mattered was being attractive to people of the opposite sex, or the same sex if you were that way inclined, and being seen to be successful, like having validation. So external validation became the thing as a teenager. That's how you stayed safe. Yeah. And then you wake up at 30 or 40 and you realize you went from being a teenager that craved attention to going into the workforce, to going into a family life. Now you're 40 and you say, wait a second, my whole life has been about other people. What about me? Yeah. And then instead of consciously making some tangible steps, you see the guy that leaves his partner, gets a younger partner, gets a sports car. And what's he doing? He's acting like the teenager that got shut down when he was 14 or 15. He's gone back to that level of consciousness.
Oh my God. Yeah, I could literally see so many guys I know very well. That exact thing happened. They got a tattoo. Bad one. It's not so funny. Because I think, because I kind of had like a 30, when I was 30, I had a a midlife crisis, if you wish. And it wasn't because I'd not spent the money on cars, but it was like but mine was like, I just went so deep into men's work. Like I was like, really, I'm just going to go really just different groups. The thing I found a lot of though is that I didn't enjoy men's work. Like I didn't enjoy stereotypical men's work. I found it it wasn't my guys. It wasn't my group. So I created a group, and I think that what I think a lot of men need, especially, is this work, and it's quite, what's the word for it? Paradoxical. It's the very work that most men need to do is the very work that they distrust and find weird. Or, and I was even explaining this to my brother, is that when I went through the biggest struggles in my life, divorce, business was upside down, I got a really good therapist, and that really helped me. Yeah. But it's almost like sometimes it needs these, it's part of the hero's journey. You need that to happen, that trials, tribulations, temptations part of the cycle to drive you to go and fix your trauma and your things that are ultimately holding you back.
Yeah. I don't know if it came from David Data or if it's just, I remember him talking about, I think it was about life purpose being like layers of an onion, that you're continuously peeling back layers. You don't arrive at your purpose. It's just an unfolding thing. But I've noticed in my own life that I get this feeling inside of me, like I'm quite sensitive. So energetically, if I'm doing something I'm not enjoying, I just can't lie to myself. Like I can't look myself in the mirror, and it's like a blessing and a curse, because once something's done for me, I kind of step away from it. But my kind of life philosophy is that we come into this world and we're supposed to have certain experiences to teach us certain lessons, and that will happen throughout our lifetime. So you'll have the experience, the lesson will emerge. You can either listen to the lesson or ignore it. And I think the more you ignore the lesson, the more painful it gets, as you kind of allude to there. So like a simple example is, if alcohol is an issue for you and you get a really bad hangover, that's a lesson. But if you don't listen to the lesson, maybe it keeps happening and eventually your world burns to the ground. So I think raising in consciousness, not to get too esoteric or too fancy, but I think like living in higher levels of consciousness is about recognizing a little bit sooner the lessons, rather than my external world having to fall to the ground, actually learning to listen to myself and make the change before I have to.
My God, yeah, that's so weird. I was reading, one of my Bibles is Straight Line Leadership by Dusan Djukic. Is like, and he talks about this idea is like a problem versus a decision. And like when we don't make decisions and we have problems, we build this ability to cope. We cope with things, and the more problems we have, the more we cope. When originally it was just a decision. You drank too much. You had a decision. Don't do that again. But you just ignored it. You didn't make a decision. I actually made a decision just to reduce my alcohol over the last 5 years. Like every year subsequently, I've just drank less and less and less. Like last year, I probably drank 2-3 beers, maybe a bit more, but not much at all. And I feel way better. Do you drink?
Every now and then, yeah.
Yeah, it's strange. It's like I think as I've become more, especially A, too older, B, conscious. It's not my weapon of choice anymore. I just don't think it's real helpful for me as a guy. You talk about like in your body, like coming back to I think that's something that. So I'm a guy who really finds myself. I've got a team, and I get super angry. I don't know how to lead in a place of calm mind, stillness, support. I see that as like weakness. I see that. Like, how do I actually resolve that? Because so many leaders I talk to, is they get so darn frustrated with staff and people around them just not doing the work or letting them down, and they become very, very independent. They don't want to give things out. What would you say that from a shadow perspective? What would that be?
I tie loads of different modalities and stuff together, but there's a concept of polyvagal theory, which is kind of nervous system work. Nervous system, the connection between the body and mind, is a simple way of thinking about it. And the theory, which some people kind of dispute, is that when we feel grounded and safe in the world, we're in, a grounded and safe, connected place. We can be creative, logical, we can think about the future, we can look people in the eyes, we can create amazing things in the world when we feel safe. When we feel stressed, we shift into either fight or flight. Fight is the challenge in front of me I can manage, so I'm going to dominate it. So like maybe I'm going to dominate my staff. I'm stressed and I'm just going to put the power over them. Flight is the challenge is too big for me, so I'm going to run away from it. And then the final response is if it all becomes a bit too much, or if I spend too long in a stress state, I go into shutdown. So taking that idea, leaders could map who they become in those 3 different states. So the first state was green, like think of a traffic light system. Green, this is me as a healthy leader. Map out what that looks like, what the key actions are. Orange is fight or flight. So this is kind of a little bit stressed. I've kind of lost my center. Again, the question, who do I become in those moments? And then red is I lose my, like for me, red is I feel like a helpless little boy. I feel like a victim. I feel lost in life. Orange is I'm a busy fool, just like staying busy because I don't want to stop and consciously think about where I'm going. Green is I'm grounded. I'm clear. I'm communicating well. I'm able to articulate my ideas. I'm working on a vision in the future. So I'd encourage people to start with that. And then the second piece that's really important, we talk about the body, is there's no point trying to think positive when your body's in a dysregulated state. In other words, when you're in a stress state, because you can't access your logical thinking mind. There's, I don't know who's going to be watching and who's going to be listening, but there's ideas sometimes shared that if you imagine your thumb being like the reptilian brain, so the old part of your brain where reactivity lives, and then your fingers wrap over the top and they represent your conscious mind that's like a genius, like really great ideas, really creative, enthusiastic, passionate, etc., etc. When you get stressed, you literally flip the lid and lose access to all that creativity. And so you're acting out of impulse. And so the way to come back online, really simple way, is to take a couple of deep breaths. So breathe in through your nose, extend your exhale. Basically, when you notice yourself becoming the person you don't want to be as a leader, take 4 or 5 conscious breaths and then reassess. I mean, that would be a kind of practical step I would start with.
So good. You've nailed it. That's really, really good. I love that question as well. Like, who do you become when you're stressed? Like that's a really good question, isn't it?
Sometimes when I have a group, like a group comes in, whatever the group is, I'll ask people just to check in with themselves and ask them, how are you defending yourself in this moment? Because we're always defending ourselves. Like I'll come on, I'm on this podcast and I'm defending myself by trying to like certain ways. Like I want to make it seem like, okay, I feel like I know what I'm doing, but I also have parts of me that are like, oh, I don't know if I know enough. So there's ways I'm defending myself. So ask yourself, how am I defending myself?
Hey, Pat, it's all welcome. Pat, it's all welcome. All welcome. You're safe, bro.
What am I afraid would happen if I didn't defend myself? And then rather than ignore that part, could I maybe put that part at ease? So
I think you should answer that for the sake of the podcast.
How am I defending myself? How am I defending? What would happen? I'd be ridiculed. I'd be shamed. I'd lose my credibility. That's what the part of me that's scared might believe, if I say the wrong thing. And so again, I would check in with that part of myself. That's not the 37-year-old Pat that's in a good place in his life. That's the 7-year-old boy who is worried about saying the wrong thing,
Yeah, it's a triggering question, actually. How are you defending yourself right now? And I think that my defense is to go more extrovert. So like, how do I defend myself? I go way more, I talk more. And then I also, in rooms, sometimes I'm like, shut the fuck up, man. I'm like, you're talking too much. And then it's like, then I become kind of, what's the word, meta-conscious about, oh my gosh, you're talking too much. And then you're doubting yourself about what you're talking about. And then, oh my gosh, you're oversharing. Because I share a lot anyway, I'm very transparent. But then I can be like, oh my gosh, I'm oversharing. And all this is going on whilst I'm talking. And I'm like, what's this?
So what are you afraid would happen if that didn't happen?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Because even like, I've built a group of buddies in Dubai, and we got on a boat the other day. It was like 8 of us going on a barbecue boat. And I was like, I remember showing up and I was like, I drop into the pool sometimes. And what am I worried about? I don't know. That's a really hard question to answer.
If you did know.
Yeah, I know, you bastard. What am I worried about? I'm finding this really hard to answer. It's probably that people won't like me. Yeah, it's probably like people won't like me. Yeah.
We won't go to therapy session. I was going to say, what age is the part of you?
Dude, I'm all open. It's like, that's a really interesting, because like, that question for so many leaders, like, how am I defending myself? Because I arrive into coaching sessions sometimes, and you can see someone's just defending themselves in the coaching session, and I'm like, okay, I've got to break this down a little bit. And like, that's I'm going to steal that question.
Yeah, do. Yeah. Well, it's again, it comes back to that piece. At some point in life, we didn't feel safe. We came up with a short-term strategy to stay safe in that moment. And then sometimes the strategy became so ingrained that it's an unconscious defense now. So I was bullied. I learned to be the funny guy. and now I can't not be the funny guy, and it just gets in
That's
the way of
probably what it
connection.
is. You probably nailed it, actually. Like when I was look back to in my school days, when I was funny, extrovert, I was liked way more. And when I was just like kind of not engaged, slow, I was just like forgotten, not liked as much. So I think that's like you've nailed it. That's really interesting. I
Just
think
one thing, to say, Ben, on that, like, because I think it's probably important to say. Sometimes when I do workshops and stuff like that, there'll be one or two in the audience, and they'll say, "Can we overthink this stuff?" And are we going too far into this stuff? And I always say to people, look, you look at how your life is going, and if there's something that's kind of, challenging or sticky, or you feel something's not working, then I would explore it. But I wouldn't be encouraging people to go and like be asking themselves in every moment, how am I defending myself? But it's more just a query where, yeah, I'm maybe I'm not feeling the connection I would like to feel, or I feel guarded, or whatever it might be. And I suppose the other one piece is, as much as I'm a huge fan of personal development and shadow work and books, obviously I write books, I do tell people that life always presents you with the challenges that you need in this given moment. So sometimes you don't need to go back to your past, you just look at what's there, and that will direct you to kind of what needs work.
Yeah, I think the interesting part of it was like I on many occasions I've gone into rooms and like, have I been too much there? Have I shared too much? There was a disproportionate to, and like I don't second guess myself a lot. I'm quite confident, and it was like that's one arena that I wanted. And I think a lot of, especially professional people, business people, they go into rooms all the time, and it's quite a vulnerable situation. Like new group of people, I find elevator pitches about who I am very, very difficult. It's just like, I love what I do. I know exactly what I do, who I work with. Put me in front of a group of people to talk on stage, I'm fine. Have to introduce myself, find it really difficult.
Well, my strategy would not be in the room. I just wouldn't want to be there.
Yeah, that's very true. So then part of what I learned about shadow was that what you're trying to do is you're trying to use your shadow to fight part X. This is like the tools thinking, because I found that really helpful, is that in order to overcome this kind of self-sabotaging part of ourselves that is trying to hold us back, we've got to use the bits in our shadow to bring our whole self to our life. Can you talk to that from what you understand? Because I think that would be really interesting to hear.
If I'm kind of taking you up the right way, the way I would frame it maybe is, there's aspects of myself I've denied. So maybe the listener could think about how they like to be described and how they like to be seen, and then consider what the opposite is. So I like to be seen as easygoing. The opposite maybe is being confrontational. And then I might explore confrontation as an idea, and I might say like, okay, how am I, or have I got the potential to be confrontational? Where might confrontational be useful in my life? And that's kind of how you can start to use that energy. And then coming back to the body-based piece, maybe like it could be something as simple as getting on the punch bag, visualizing the person you want to be confrontational with, and expressing some of that energy. I don't know if that's how you mean, but
yeah, no, you're right on. I think it's like one of the things that I noticed that part of, even I expressed it earlier, part of me as a leader, I've been way more loving over the last, say, 5 years, especially since having kids. Like the girls have just softened me so much. And one of the things that my mum said to me actually a couple of weeks ago, she said, Ben, like your superpower is love. Like that's your superpower. I never saw that. Like 20s, I would never have resonated with that word. And I was like, hang on a second. Yeah, actually, that's part of me. Have a look back, and especially with your frame, is that wasn't a big thing that was shown in my family life. Like my parents were both very loving towards me, but I didn't see a lot of it in my family. They weren't loving with each other, as I can remember. And this is a question, is probably more about, if somebody engages with this type of work, what is the likely results that they're likely to see? What starts to change in their life from what you've seen working with clients, and what are some of the big shifts that happen?
There's I don't know what the word is for the frame that I use. I put it in my last book. I say it's ARC, which is stands for awareness, reflection, and choice. So ARC, the ARC model. Awareness is shining the light on something you didn't previously see. Reflection is thinking about how has that impacted you, or could that impact you going forward. And then choice is you've got different choice potentially. So come back to where we started. I said like what you're aware of, you're in control of. What you're not aware of is in control of you. So the work really is, someone comes to a workshop and they recognize that their pattern in relationship is that when they feel vulnerable, they go on the attack, and they get defensive and they attack. And so there's awareness now. And then they reflect on that. They say, okay, here's how this has impacted me up to this point. Here's where it's going to put me in the future if I keep doing it. And then there's choice. So now the next time they experience that vulnerability, if they've got a felt sense of that, they know how that feels in their body, they can maybe take a breath and they can make a different choice. And that's where change can start to happen. So that's kind of how I see it going from cognitive to embodied. But the changes that happen, I mean, people overcome addictions. People find the faith and the courage to do the things that they really want to do. People start having honest, authentic connections with people. People start to be willing to reveal a bit more of themselves, which opens up more kind of connection with other people. But ultimately, I think...
What about your life, actually? Sorry to interrupt, but it's like, what have you know? Because you've done like a shit ton of this work. Like, you know, this is... What's been the biggest shift in your life?
I think it's just a sense of confidence in myself. You know, I am a very insecure boy, teenager, young man. A lot of self-doubt, a lot of spotlight effect of thinking everyone's looking at me and judging me. And there's still some of that there at times. But I think it's confidence. You know, when I was young, I thought confidence would come from achieving things. But my belief in confidence is that confidence comes from knowing you can be with all parts of yourself or lots of parts of yourself. So coming back to what we talked about earlier, if I'm afraid of my fear, when fear comes up, my confidence disappears. If I'm afraid of my anxiety, when anxiety comes up, my confidence disappears. And it's just this situational thing. Oh, I'm confident when I'm successful, but I feel like shit when I'm on my own. So I think it's confidence is the general thing. I believe in myself. Beyond what I do, I believe in who I am, you know?
That's so fucking good. I think if you're listening to the podcast, just rewind what he just said and play it like maybe 3 or 4 times, maybe 5. That's so good. I've not heard that before. So
I was on a podcast, Ben, I think, I don't know, a year ago, and the guy came straight in, first question, Pat, do you love yourself? And I was like, what? And my response was, you know, it's easy for me to love myself when I'm achieving, when I'm getting validation, when I'm feeling positive, when I feel social. It's still more difficult for me to love myself when I'm lonely or I'm unsure of myself or I'm in transition or I'm in the messy middle. But I think the work is, coming back to your question, like, what has this given me? It's given me more capacity to stay with myself when I'm in those moments. So again, it's like, who do you become when you're not the successful guy? And can you be with that? People talk about this idea of holding space all the time, like holding space for each other. It's easy to hold space. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. I find it easier to hold space for other people than it is to hold space for myself at times. But that's the work, is can I allow myself to feel my feelings without having to immediately get away from them?
Yeah, that's so good, because I think that I don't think, going back to that question, do you love yourself? My default response is yes. I'm like very much like, I love myself. And then I realized a lot of people and I have conditional love for ourselves. I'll love myself if. And I really found conditional love, because I'd never experienced it. I had both my parents love me unconditionally. I've really had that all the way through my childhood. I was really, really lucky to have that from both my parents. I had it first time I experienced the pain of conditional love was when I got divorced. It was like, the statement was, I will love you, I will be your wife if you're tidy, if you do this, if you do that. And it was like all these conditions, and I was like, oh my gosh. And I was like, nope, checking out this. And I remember going home, walking in through the door, and I was like massively defeated. My relationship was over. Just had this unconditional love for my mum. You know, I remember them. It's like, because it could feel it, I knew it. And I was like, oh my God. And I realized this a couple of weeks ago when I made a mistake and I was so horrible to myself. And I think that's what happens with people and self-love, is that they will love themselves if it's conditional. And as soon as you can move out of that, I was like, yeah, this is what my work is. It's like, when I make massive mistakes, can I still love myself through that? Back to the point where I'm ready to go again. I think that this is not just me. I think this is so many people. Is that the reason people struggle so much when they get knocked down is because they don't use the lover, they use the warrior or the shadow warrior or it's just like the authoritarian. And I think that when you learn to go to compassion when you've had a knockback over criticism, you get up way quicker. I think that's what I've noticed with my work. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah. There's something that's coming to me that ties in. I think it ties in with a few bits we've spoke about. Like, one is, we talk about these 3 layers when we're growing up that condition us to be a certain way. Not doing this work means you live your life out in accordance to those layers. So you don't get to live your own life. You live the life that was given to you, which is fine if that's what you want. But Bronnie Ware, who you probably know, she wrote that book, 5 Regrets of the Dying. Have you heard of that book?
Yeah, I think Phil Richards talked about it years ago. Yeah, I've
So
never read it.
she was a
Never read it.
palliative care nurse, spent a lot of time with people as they were dying, and irrespective of their backgrounds, it was the same regrets kept coming up. The biggest one was, I wish I'd lived a life true to myself and not the one that was expected of me. So if we think about doing the work, there's the idea of individuation, which is becoming the individual, like becoming your authentic self effectively. And just something I wanted to kind of throw in that there's I think was insightful for me in recent years was sometimes we create oppositional identities. And you hear this when people say things like, I'll never be like my father, or I'll never be like that person. And so in those moments when you say, I'll never be, and you rebel against the thing that you don't want to be, you lose your individuation because you're not choosing who you're going to be in the world. You're choosing from a place of reaction who you're not going to be. And so what does this work give you? It gives you the capacity to be able to be with yourself in different environments, which allows you to kind of uncover who you actually are beyond kind of the conditional setup. Because again, the 3 layers, you were told who you can be and who you can't be. The challenge and the work for us all is being with ourselves when we step outside of who we were supposed to be. If you were told to be the good boy and you learned how to be the good boy, stepping outside of that role seems like bad and seems shameful. And can you love yourself when you feel shame?
Yeah, someone should write a book on this. Yeah.
Someone should transcribe this so I don't have to write the book.
So the book's finished. Yeah, the book is finished. I asked for a copy. This whole podcast was just me trying to be a freeloader, trying to get a free copy of his book. But it's coming out soon. It's like real soon.
Yeah. I fly home in 2 weeks for a book tour, so it comes out February 27th. I think it's out in pre-order now, and it's been really healthy response, which has been great. And on a personal, selfish level, it feels pretty cool that over the years I did, I've done some interesting things and cool things, but a lot of the time it was looking at the market and what does the market need and stuff. This is very much kind of like I've gone on a personal journey for the last 10 years and I wrote a book about that. And I think it's going to hit at the right time where my what I see is that, and I wasn't thinking this way, I wrote the book I wanted to write and I enjoyed writing it, but I feel like the personal development industry obviously has gotten bigger over the years. And I think a certain percentage of that audience will have matured beyond the point of thinking it's as simple as setting a goal and achieving the goal, because it's not that simple.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I've noticed is that in my work with the men's groups, like especially from 30 to 37, I did talk a lot about this at work. And I think recently I've not gone as deep, even just reflecting on what I studied a lot of this work. And this is so important beyond the what do you want, how are you going to get it? And it's such understanding that.
It is. Like, I must admit that, like, for me, when I go deep dive into this stuff, and sometimes I lose the more, it's probably another way of bypassing, right? Like to not want to do the day-to-day stuff and to want to keep exploring your life and not actually do the basics. That's sometimes where I get caught. Like, I hired a business coach a couple of months ago to tell me not anything I didn't already know, but to kind of say, start putting yourself out there more, because my shadow was hiding, So I think there's a value, kind of coming back to what you talked about at the start. You said that you were very the athlete and you drove a lot of you, and then maybe you didn't have as much comfort with the restful part, and obviously you learned that the balance of the two is important. So it's ultimately doing and being, isn't it? It's like setting goals is useful as long as you know where the goal is coming from and what's driving it.
Yeah, because I actually think I flip between the two. It's like, I think when you do this work, I noticed, like, especially when I did a lot of this work between 30 and 37, one of the things I removed so much of my pain. I noticed it in my training and my drive. I was like, I need to find a new force. I need to find new things to drive me. Like I remember I look at some of the times I ran it as a kid, and I was running away from things. I was so driven by pain. I used to be able to like endure so much pain, and now I'm in a lot of pain. I'm just like, just chill, man. It's okay. You don't need to do this. Yeah. It's just like the one thing that made me successful is the one thing I got rid of doing a lot of this work. And it's like, I think a big part of that with a new goal is shifting that to desire and love. Yeah, I think.
And the challenge is that we don't see much of it in the in the outer world. It's like, if you look at the archetypal work, they always say the healthy king is the hardest thing to see in the world, because most of our leaders and politicians are driven from a place of wanting power as opposed to coming from a healthy place. So it's like, yeah, who are the heart-centered business people that we can look to? I don't know, is heart-centered even the word, but like, it's interesting coming out here a couple of weeks ago at the Bali. There's a lot of digital nomads and stuff, but to some degree I see like the blind leading the blind, and it's like wounded boys teaching wounded boys how to buy Ferraris, which is cool, but maybe they'll outgrow that. That's what I see.
Yeah, it's not really ever been my thing. I think I've just had a really expensive personal development habit that I've had
Yeah, me too.
to
Me too.
spend. Yeah.
Maybe it's as bad. Maybe it's as bad. Who knows?
I actually sat down the other week and I was like, if I wouldn't have spent as much as I spent on personal development, I could have had multiple Ferraris. But I'm just like, just doesn't rev my engine, so to speak. So just kind of real winding this up because I've really enjoyed this. By the way, thank
Yeah,
you, man.
thank you. You too, man.
It's the book is called Shadow Work. I recommend you buy it. Like honestly, the way that Pat's articulated this, like I've done loads of work and I really like that. And this is something I've noticed in all your books. You're very, very good at making complicated easy to understand. I think that's really one of your skills. If you are interested in you might have heard about shadow work and you're thinking like, well, where do I start? Is that where you kind of go in the book part and you explain that?
Yeah, the book, like, it's pretty comprehensive. So the book starts with looking at like how our shadow is formed, and the reader gets to kind of explore their own personal shadow. Then it looks at how the shadow impacts us. So like, what are the signs that our shadow is activated? It looks at who we became to stay safe in the world. So some of us became overachievers or bullies. Then it looks at the connection with the body. Then it looks at anger, grief, shame, fear, and then finally it looks at the shadow in relationships. So how the shadow plays out in our intimate relationships. So it's pretty comprehensive. It's got workbook. It's got embodiment tools, and yeah, it's funny. Some people say I make complex ideas a bit more digestible. Other people say I dumb things down to an embarrassing level. So you both are true. The academics,
Yeah.
the academics will challenge me.
Yeah, but I think that's actually a gift of many trainers. Is like I realized in fitness that the market was the 90% on the couch, and I think that that's what I saw for you. Like you're like taking very, very complicated texts and ideas, and you're giving them to the 90% on the couch who want to go and change their life. I'm not saying that your market is the people on the couch, but it's like most people are not even really sure where to start with this work. And I can guarantee, so that is the market. So if you just like people have just started to learn about shadow work, it's going to be a really comprehensive way for them to step into it. And yeah, I really endorse everything that Pat does. Thank you so much, brother. I really enjoyed that conversation.
Thanks, Ben. Just to thank you, can I thank you publicly?
I'll accept your thank you.
So yeah, but I think a year ago, I think it was a year ago, I was a bit like confused as to my next move, and I'm not a good businessman in the sense that when I'm done with something, I kind of just walk away and burn my ships and move on to something new. And I was a bit unsure of where I was going next. And you did a coaching call with me, which was very supportive. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you publicly for that. So you're a master at what you do.
Always here for you, man. And yeah, keep shining your light. Thank you, brother. Oh, don't click leave.